Welcome to C-SPAN's weekly look at the people and politics of the United Kingdom. Next, from London, an interview with British Member of Parliament Tony Benn. Mr. Benn discusses the recent publication of his diaries on CD-ROM. The Benn Diaries are his account of British life and politics since 1934. Our C-SPAN crew in London caught up with Mr. Benn while he was conducting an interview with BBC Radio.
Finally, look at West Yorkshire's weather. Sunny spells will develop today, along with a few showers. One or two of them will be heavy. It won't be as sticky as yesterday, but still very warm. The top temperature, 26 degrees Celsius. Tonight, any showers will soon die out to give a dry night, feeling much fresher than of late. The overnight low, 11 degrees Celsius. BBC News from West Yorkshire and the world. It's 6 minutes past 9.
News Talk with Dave Woods. Call now on Leeds 443222.
Good morning again. Very simple question we're asking on News Talk today. Do we spend too much money on defence? Today, the final touches are being made to the Defence Cost Study, the Frontline First report. The report to be published tomorrow after the formal approval of the Cabinet. A lot of attention has been paid to the Rosyth situation in particular, but it's a much wider defence report than that. Up to 30,000 jobs in defence could be lost or privatised, according to some analysts. But the question we're asking today is, should we be scrapping larger numbers of our armed services and be spending less on our nuclear capabilities so that more money can be handed over to the health service, to education, or investment in other jobs? Have we now got, in the words of Tony Benn, the best defended dole-queues in the world? Or is it vital that we have the best defence force possible to maintain our role in vital peacekeeping missions and protect other aggressive nations? Once again, I'm joined in the studio and on the line by a number of guests, but do you think we spend too much money on defence is the question we're asking. Ring now with your views, 0532 443222. Well, amongst our guests with us this morning is Tony Benn, who's the Labour MP for Chesterfield. Good morning to you, Mr. Benn.
Good morning.
A simple question then. Do we spend too much money on defence?
Well, let's first of all work out what we do spend. Every family of four spends £31 on weapons before they've paid the rent, bought the children's food. So you take any family and say, supposing some or all of that £31, it wouldn't be all, of course, were available for other things, would you feel safer? Do you feel more threatened by someone who's going to vandalise your car or by a nuclear attack from North Korea? And I think when you look at it like that, that's after all a lot of money. It's well over £1,500 a year. That's the first thing. Then the second thing you say to yourself is it sensible that 6 out of 10 of all the scientists should be making weapons of war when there are so many things that need to be dealt with that are closer to home? You know, there are all sorts of technologies that could be applied to help the disabled or to assist in the conquering of disease and so on. And I think the truth is the Cold War, which is now over, was an excuse for enormous funding of weapon systems we didn't need. And of course we don't have independent nuclear deterrence either. I mean, it's a complete illusion. If the British Prime Minister pressed the button, the British so-called independent deterrent would go up and come down again unless the Americans switched on their international satellite guidance system. So we don't have our own nuclear weapons, and to have had 5 elections or more discussing whether we should retain what we've never had is an absurdity. I think it'd be better if people looked at it in that way.
We've seen the effects of cutting defence spending this very week, and your Labour Party colleagues, very many of them, campaigning to keep open Rosyth, for example. And one of the effects of cutting defence spending is you get more people on the dole queue.
Yeah, but it isn't about cutting defence spending. It's about reallocating money and resources from the means of death to the means of life. I mean, I remember at the end of the war, we moved 4 million people from uniform and weapons production to civil production within 18 months. I mean, in Bristol, which I used to represent, for example, the bombers stopped coming out of the Bristol Aircraft Company, and a few weeks later, on the same trucks and trolleys, came prefabricated houses. I mean, it's a question not just of cutting, it's a question of diversifying our skill so that we produce what we need. Now, ask yourself this. Why is it that the shops are full of Japanese cars, Japanese cameras, Japanese videos, Japanese motorbikes, Japanese this and that, when what we seem to be better at selling missiles to Saddam Hussein? Why? Because all our money is in weapons, and the Japanese have moved into the area of consumer goods. It's true in America too. The Americans are really, well, they're the biggest debtor country in the world. The United States doesn't need and can't afford all these weapons, and the Japanese and Germans are now taking over American industry. So it is really a question. If you look at the world today and were asked simply to say, apart from the United States, which is streets ahead of anyone else, who are the two most powerful countries in the world? You'd say Japan and Germany. What characterizes each of them? That they haven't spent much money on weapons. So, it's common sense, really, and it's not even about, as you say, throwing people on the dole. It's about using people's skill to meet the needs we really have, instead of keeping the military establishments up for quite different reasons.
Well, finally then, because I know you have to leave us very soon.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
If you were the author of the defence cost study, Frontline First, which is coming out tomorrow, what would you put in it?
Well, I think you can't ask somebody a serious question like that. What I think is we should have a steady progress of diversification of the most brilliant engineers and scientists in Britain, from producing weapons that would kill people to producing the things that we need to make life tolerable, and not just in this country, but for assisting in the rest of the world. I think the arms trade, which is a product of defence industries, is the most criminal thing in the world. It's worse than drugs trade, it's worse than the AIDS epidemic, because it's sponsored by government. And to sell weapons to crooks all over the world to make a quick buck, then when they use the weapons, you immediately call for a ceasefire. And then when the war is settled down, all the arms manufacturers go to see whose weapons work best, and then they sell them to some other crooks. My God, it's time we woke up, isn't it, to the harsh realities, instead of living in the cloud cuckoo land that everyone who sells a bomb to somebody else makes the world safer, makes it much more dangerous, and bankrupts us into the bargain.
Well, that's Tony Benn, who's the Labour MP for Chesterfield. Also with us on the programme this morning, Rob Green, who's a retired naval commander. He's now...
Right, there we are. That was that.
Tony Benn, Member of Parliament. Most people in political life here in Britain are very familiar with the Benn Diaries, but we in the States would not be. What are they?
Well, it's simply that all my life I've been a diarist. I began, I think the first entry was when I was 9 in 1934, didn't keep it up. Then during the war I wrote in manuscript little volumes. It was illegal to keep a diary if you were in the Air Force or the services, in case you were captured and they discovered where you were. So some of it's in code, and I've had to decode it. And then after the war, it came, it was patchy again, but since 1963, about 30-odd years, every day. And of course, if you've had an interesting life, as I have in Parliament and travelling around the world and so on, if you keep a record of it, then you are able to access it and what you learn, what happened. The only real teacher in life is experience. I mean, you can read books, but it's what happens to you that really teaches you. So if you note what happens, then at the end of the day record it, and then it's transcribed and you read it. You're getting about 3 bites at everything, and I find it very handy indeed. And then I decided to publish, and they've been of interest to people. Published about 5 volumes, now the volume's coming out in September, and then there'll be 1 more volume before I hang up my tape recorder.
How do you think you really first got started back at the age of 9?
Well, my father, both my grandfathers were members of Parliament, so I come from a political background. And my father kept a lot of files, and at the weekend I used to go down to his basement office, rather like mine, used to help him. And he was a great believer that if you were in politics, you had to study things seriously. It was no good just living on the headlines. And he took the newspapers, the London Times every day, and he indexed it with a decimal system of his own. He cut it and stuck it in books. So by lunchtime, every subject he was following was up to date. Now, of course, all that's done by information systems. And he was most meticulous, and he had quite good diaries. And I don't know how it was precisely, but I can't go to bed if I haven't done my diary now. It's more addictive than my pipe or alcohol for some people. It's something you simply have to get done. And I don't regret it, though it takes up about an extra hour or more every day.
Is there at all an element of ego?
Well, people wonder about it. I mean, no more than you're insisting on doing interviews. You know, I could say to you, well, will you come to my home? Isn't it an ego trip? No, I mean, since I didn't publish till 40 years after it was over, it was what you might call a delayed ego. Because how could I, when I was writing during the war? For example, at the end of the war, I came across this letter that's coming in the new volume now, which is sort of diary letter. I was rowing on the Sea of Galilee. I was an RAF pilot in Palestine that war. I was rowing in the Sea of Galilee, and we landed at Capernaum. And an old Jew came up and said, war over, and we didn't believe him. And then we saw the papers, and I reported my letters. I had an ice cream and an orange squash in a little Arab cafe. Now, would that be ego or the excitement of this awful, ghastly war ending? I think it's a mistake to think it's that. But clearly there is an element of personal feeling enters into it, bound to. That's what you're human beings, and at night some of your anger or hopes or fears come off the tape because you feel it.
How meticulously do you record your day?
Well, when I was in the cabinet, or if something really interesting happens, if we had a cabinet from 10 till 1, I would miss my lunch, and from notes I'd made in the morning, I'd go and record it. Some days, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 words for a single day, which is a lot. And it depends on the holidays. I mean, I make a few notes, and perhaps at the end we'll note down what's happened. World events I try and bring in if they're very important. But it does very much depend what happens in a day. I'm very meticulous about time. I don't know why, but if I said caught a train about 8:43 in the morning and we arrived at 11:14, and so I have this very Victorian idea that you have to account for your time on the Day of Judgment. And so a lot of that diary is a bit like the Day of Judgment, because it's not like memoirs. Memoirs are what you write at the end of your life, inventing triumphs and forgetting failures. I mean, diaries are confessions. Every mistake I've ever made politically is meticulously recorded in the diary. They're not journalism, which you read tomorrow. They're not history, which is written by somebody else and covers the whole span. They are a contemporary record of what happened and what you thought and who you met. And from that point of view, they have a certain vitality about them. But of course, only one person's view.
Do you supplement your day with other materials?
Well, every night before I go to bed, I file in these little boxes. All the papers relating to the day are clipped together. So if you go back to the diary and look at what's there, and it will say a committee meeting, attached to the notes in the box will be all the notes made at that meeting. Then press reports, speeches, personal notes. They're filed in about four or five different boxes, and then as the boxes fill up, I put them in proper boxes. I've got them in. I've got the archives now in about 7 garages or sheds, and they're very, very comprehensive. And I can find things immediately. See, that's recently we were discussing whether Prince Charles should ascend the throne. Well, I'm a Republican, or what I suppose I might call a Democrat, if it's not confusing for you. I looked back at the proclamation of Edward VIII in 1936, which was 59 years ago. It was in my files. I found it within 10 seconds, telling you exactly what happens when the king dies and somebody succeeds. So they're working papers. I use them every day. And material going back many, many years I can pull out instantly, make available, use, circulate, and so on. So it is really my own personal political library. That's what it is. You
can find things easily, but could others if they needed to?
Well, it's a good question, really, because the diary itself is now being put on a CD-ROM. And yesterday in London, at the university, we had a demonstration of it. Nobody's ever put an uncut political diary on a CD-ROM. At the moment, it's primarily the text. But, of course, it will be multimedia, and some of that was shown yesterday. So when we came to a bit of the diary, the text appeared on the screen, and then you could hear the recording, which was added. You could see videos of debates in the House of Commons. You could put the archives in facsimile there. So you could actually recreate, and anyone under about 10 will understand this totally. You could just take all your stuff and put it together. But the value of that is for students, because I've had people come from all over the world, from Canada and America, from Germany, Japan, China, India, and so on, to this house in order to go through my papers for their books. There's a guy from Harvard came and spent weeks in the garden reading in detail everything that I had done about the International Monetary Fund crisis of 76, and then he sent me the book he'd written, and there were 50 references to the diary, because it was the only diarist at the time. So the purpose of keeping them is for them to be of value to other people, so they could use them. And school kids and students write every day, and I send little bits out. So what I've learned is if you file your waste paper basket for 50 years, you build a public library. It's the simplest way of building a public library, but you have to be able to find it. And I would need an awful lot of money to put the entire documentation on a database. And if I were former American president, I would get that money because they do that. But here it's a struggle. I mean, I know where it is, but I will try and get money for that. And then I'm leaving the whole thing to the British Library, which is the sort of equivalent of the Library of Congress.
Would the British Library then have the resources to file your past works?
Well, I don't know. I think I may have to go out and search for funds myself, because it is very expensive. I mean, the transcription, for example, of 12 million words simply from tape to thing was very expensive. The published diaries, I had a little advance which helped to cover it. But I must have spent tens and tens of thousands of pounds on the cassettes, the tapes, the discs, the floppy disks, the equipment, the boxes, the sheds, and so on. But it means that everything you say is rooted in some real knowledge. You're not just living off the headlines and the opinion polls, like so many people in politics, adjusting what you say to what pleases people. You really want to know. For example, in 1935, when I was 10, I distributed literature. And I went through it the other day, or 2 or 3 years ago, and I found in it a little leaflet issued by the National Union of Mine Workers, or what was then called the Mine Workers Federation of Great Britain, showing that in the previous 9 years, when the coal mines were privately owned, 7,800 miners had been killed and 1,100,000 miners had been injured in the pits when they were privately owned. So I took that leaflet, blew it up, photocopied it, and distributed it again, because when they wanted to privatize the pits, take them out of public ownership and sell them off, here was what would happen in health and safety. So here was a document I had had for 59 years, just being suddenly pulled out and used again. Now that gives me huge pleasure, because so much of what we learn we forget. Generations die and young people have to learn it again. So to have access to what we know, well, after all, it's a case for education, isn't it, really? I found that very useful, very exciting, and nothing to do with me at all. I just happened to have distributed it when I was a 10-year-old, that's all.
What about the safety of those 40 and 50-year-old documents? What keeps them from being destroyed just by weather conditions?
Well, I have had somebody from the British Library who specialised in conservation to look at all my papers, and some of them are deteriorating. Apparently the best way of keeping papers is to write them out with a quill pen on parchment and leave them in an old monastery where the wind blows through and it's very cold. And of course, how long do any modern bits of equipment, how long will a cassette last? I had a letter not long ago from a guy in America who wrote to me and said, in 1949, I heard you give a speech, which I did, in Boston, or Cambridge rather, at a summer school, the Summer Institute for Social Progress. I was on my honeymoon, but my wife very kindly agreed to come. And he said, I recorded it. Would you like the tape? So I said, yes, I would. Well, when it arrived, it was a spool this size, and it was paper tape coated with plastic. Well, of course, I couldn't play it. So I sent it to the BBC labs, and they recorded it and put it on a little cassette. But all modern technology, even a CD-ROM, how long will that last? So, I mean, in a way, it is a struggle against the old hymn, change and decay, and all around I see, O God who changes not, abide with me. It is, you can't keep everything, but my goodness, it's useful when you have it.
You mentioned technology, and tell me over the course of time how you've changed your technologies as the times have changed.
Yeah, I start with a pencil in a school notebook. Then it moved up to, those little bound volumes where I wrote it all. Then, as I got into Parliament, I used to, sometimes try to type, but I couldn't type very well. Computers have changed that. Then to dictate it to a secretary. And then from that to recording it. And then recording, transcribing, and and I've kept every old recording machine I've ever had. I've got an old wire recorder made by Webster in Chicago, which I bought in 1950 for £70, which is a lot of money in those days. And there, when the wire broke, you just tied a knot in it. And you lost about a couple of words. And that is a marvellous bit of equipment. And keeping old technology is interesting, you see, too, because things become museum pieces so quickly. I'm afraid the awful truth is I keep everything. And very often when you look back, what you think was a great speech is quite boring. The report in the newspaper, what you really notice is the price of automobiles or what it would cost to get a new pair of shoes. And it's not what you think that's important that you keep that really matters. And I keep all the letters, or most of the letters I get on big political questions during the Gulf War, which I was totally opposed to. I got 40,000 letters. And looking at some of those letters from people who may have fought in Iraq themselves during the war, what they really thought, absolutely riveting. So it's not just what I do, it's indeed quite the opposite. It's what goes on around me that I find so educational.
Do you find the computer has been the easiest of all?
Yes, well, it was a struggle because I was defeated in Parliament because my constituency was redistricted in 1983, I think that's what you call it, and my old district was abolished and I was defeated and I got back about 10 months later. But my son, who's a computer buff, said to me, "Dad, you're 58. If you don't learn a new technology now, you never will." So I bought an old what is now an old-fashioned BBC, and I learned painfully to do it. And it has transformed my life, because I couldn't use a typewriter. I find it hard to write. And I think an awful lot of people. Of course, my grandchildren come along, and they, 4 and 5-year-olds, they just find all the equipment so familiar. It's a marvellous thing for them. They just take it for granted. But for people of my age, it's one hell of a struggle, as you may understand.
And so your computer technology, your computer archives now, which are stored on disk, will be converted to CD-ROM.
Yes. We've done about 6 years out of what will be, in the end, 60 years. Because I'm publishing a new volume. It's just gone to the printers, the Gallipoot went in yesterday. A volume of diaries from 1940 to 1962, which includes the wartime years. And since printers use discs, I'll have those discs to put on a CD-ROM. And it would be nice to have 60 years available because so much has happened. You see, the diaries begin before the last World War. And I remember so much as a child in the 30s anyway, you see. I remember the fascists marching in London. I remember hearing Hitler's broadcasts from Nuremberg, the fear of war, the knowledge it was coming and so on. Then I lost a brother and the war house was bombed. And all that perspective is so important. And looking back on the Cold War now with the benefit of hindsight, there was never a Soviet military threat, ever, to Western Europe. I mean, the West didn't like communism. But this idea that the Russians could ever plan to take over West Germany, Italy, France, arrive in London, go to Northern Ireland and deal with Ian Paisley was an illusion. But it was a tremendously valuable political illusion because it allowed any critics of the government to be denounced as agents of the KGB. Now, when you look back on the perspective of history and you come to that conclusion, which I didn't hold at the time, I was very unsure about what the Russians were doing. But it's a mind-boggling bit of information because everything we did during the Cold War, this huge arms expenditure, the pursuit of people who took dissenting opinions, the McCarthy, all that was a mistake. But it was a convenient mistake for those who spread it. So you mustn't think this is about me, really. It's about trying to understand, however difficult it is, the period of history through which we are passing, so you can make a better judgments next time. That's really what it's about.
It would seem, Mr. Benn, that whether you publish in CD-ROM or whether you publish in print, you'd need an editor. Have you worked with the same editor all along?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Ruth Winston, who came in 1985, to begin with, just a part-time job typing. And I handed the whole project over to her in the spring of '86. And she's most remarkable. First of all, she's read the whole thing, and her judgment, her political judgment, is very shrewd. And she has taken it and shaped it. And the last volume, the one when I was young, I handed over the material to her, really, and it's as if I had died, and she was handling it totally. A woman of exceptional competence. And, of course, out of this have come a lot of other projects. For example, on the BBC this summer and last summer, they took extracts of the diary from the tape as recorded and broadcast them. And Ruth Winston went through all those diaries and found the text, then went back to the tape, found the tape, and I linked it. And they became number 3 in the bestseller list of BBC tapes. Then we took speeches in Parliament. She took 10 speeches I'd made in Parliament and issued them as a video. Now, originally ordered 300, and then it now getting on for 3,000, and I sent a copy to a friend at WBAI in New York, and they broadcast it. So the 10 speeches will be broadcast in New York. And I mean, I think there is scope for what I would call serious politics, unlike the mass media, which just do the soundbite and tabloid journalism. And I think the opportunity to wire into serious libraries of knowledge, including perhaps the libraries of knowledge of people who are active in politics, is important, because otherwise people are not allowed to know what's really happening. I've been wrong many, many times in my life, and I wish, looking back on it, that I had known enough at the time to avoid the mistakes I've made. I mentioned one, this assessment of the Russians as a military threat, whatever you thought of Joe Stalin. The failure to understand that the Falklands War was an oil war. Now, I did know that because I'd been the energy minister, and I knew there was oil around the Falklands. That was why Thatcher fought. There's more oil around the Falklands than there is around the United Kingdom. That was what the war wasn't about. It was the first oil war. The Gulf War was the second oil war. So I think having a depth and understanding of what happened is the greatest possible advantage when you find great political issues cropping up. And that's been for me the value of it. And whether people read the diaries is almost irrelevant, though, matter of fact, they are quite popular.
A couple of questions come to mind as you describe it. Let's go back to your editor. You must have to have a special relationship with your editor.
Well, it's a relationship of mutual confidence. I mean, I trust her judgment totally. And she has the job, because of the publication of the volumes, of taking 90% out. And it's a pity she isn't here today to interview her, and perhaps you would like to interview her, because she judges it on the basis of a whole range of things. Its inherent importance. Very often, the judgment as to whether the issue is still alive or not. For example, the Falklands War is covered very fully because she knew that the oil was there, and therefore that was there. The miners' strike, of a year-long strike of 84, 85 is there. I think the Gulf War, which began just as the last volume ended. So her judgment is very, very profound, and she is a scholarly person herself. But we do discuss what should appear, and I trust her judgment and knowledge absolutely, completely. I sometimes think if I were dead, it would be better for everything, including the sale of the diaries.
Do you take comments on the actions of your colleagues during the day?
At night, when you come back, sometimes you treat the diary as a psychiatric couch. I think every diarist does it. Then, on the whole, I regret that. And I don't want to be malicious about anybody. So sometime, well, in the publication of the diaries, I remove that. In the CD-ROM, it'll all be there, of course. And you have to consider that. But what's actually happened, what people have said, what they've done, how the situation has developed, very, very interesting to go back over. And history repeats itself, you see, in so many ways. I mean, if you take Ireland, Britain has been occupied Ireland 400 or 500 years or maybe more, and the same issues recur time and again. The old imperialism of Queen Victoria is now the new American imperialism of President Clinton. And for example, Clinton sits in the White House and decides that he'll bomb here and bomb there. We did that. In 1920s, in the early 20s, Britain, as an imperialist power, as America is now, was the first country to use air power for colonial discipline. We used chemical weapons against the Iraqis. A man called squadron leader Major Harris of the Royal Air Force used chemical weapons by air against the Iraqis in the 20s, when the Iraqis were rising against the British. So when I went to see Saddam Hussein, I knew that although all that was said about who you might use we had used chemical against him and his people. Now that is really interesting, and it gives you a new understanding. And I see in the White House exactly Buckingham Palace under Queen Victoria. You run the world, you claim it's freedom and so on. It isn't. It's about defending your own interests, and that's what it's about. I mean, in Britain, when I was born, even 20% of the world's population was governed from London. No nonsense about civil liberties or human rights. We ran India, we ran Pakistan, we ran Nigeria, and so on. And similarly today, all the arguments about human rights and democracy is rubbish, because the United States government, to be candid, supports some of the most corrupt dictatorships in the world. There's no democracy in Saudi Arabia, but they need the oil. So I think having a historical perspective gives you an understanding and therefore you're not diverted by the big headline about the evil empire. I mean, for example, during the Cold War, the American government supported the Islamic fundamentalists to destroy communism. They funded them in Afghanistan, everywhere else. Now that the communism's ended, they find they've got that problem. Now, I think that is where some depth of understanding is important. So you're not blown off your feet by every sort of wave of media pressure. And in politics, you do have to be fairly steady if you're going to keep your mind alert and make a serious contribution.
It would seem, as you observe and record some of the people who serve around you, that would offer historians a perspective on those individuals that they could not get otherwise as well.
Well, I hope so. And if I have time, I try to write descriptive pieces, which are, colourful, and also to comment on the people that I meet. I try to be generous because I don't believe, really, that politics should be about personal abuse. There's so much personal abuse, and usually it's to cover up an absolute unity of opinion. I have a little rule myself: when people of opposite parties abuse each other to a certain degree, I say, what do they really agree about? They don't want us to know about. And so I try to develop the argument on the basis of the issue. But of course the character and personality of the people you're dealing with is important, but primarily you should listen to what they're saying and not dismiss them as a paranoid or a nut or ambitious or on an ego trip. You should actually listen, because there may be a grain of truth that is relevant to your life. And I think to be a good listener is important. My diary is full of what people tell me on the train, in the street. It's not just my musings, because some of the wisest things I've ever learned, I've learned from people who have just come up or written you a letter or something. I mean, really, the amount of human knowledge at the disposal of people in public life, if they only listen, is absolutely astonishing. And I'm much impressed by the letters I get. I read them all, 20,000 a year normally, and 40,000 in the Gulf War and so on.
Do you respond to them?
I try to, yes. If somebody writes me a really offensive letter, sort of Colonel Bromley Buckleby, you filthy swine, and so on, I write back and say, dear Colonel Bromley Buckleby, some nut has got hold of your notepaper and is using your name. I'm sure you'll know how to deal with it. And so you have a little bit of fun. But otherwise, no, I try to reply to every letter. Yes, I do, yeah.
We were talking about how your technology has changed over the years. And it strikes me that as your ability to record more instantaneously gets advanced, your diaries may become something of a threat to your contemporary politicians. You can access things that they've done instantaneously.
Well, I have heard that said, that, it's very unfair that when this generation passes, Mr. Benn's records will be the only one that survive. But then you see in the present scene, the media control what you think, and they don't share my view, or I don't share their view. So everyone has injected into them on a daily basis whatever is the conventional wisdom of the rich and the powerful. And my voice may not be heard so much now, but later, when people have forgotten what the BBC or CNN said, then of course the records will be there. And what I have learned, and this is one of the reasons why publishing the diaries was important, I had hesitation, I never intended to do it, that the media tell you what to think today, the historians tell you what to think about the day before yesterday, but yesterday is open. The media have forgotten what you're meant to believe. The historians haven't started their historic function of distorting. So from the recent past, you could reopen questions, as I've done with the Falklands War and the Cold War and so on, in discussion with you. And if you produce a documented account of what you thought and other arguments from the recent past, they're like tanks advancing over the one undefended frontier of the establishment. People have to say, oh, were we right about the Cold War? No, if we were wrong about the Cold War, it was the most monumental error, because billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars and pounds and rubles were wasted on weapons. Now, it's quite important to at least examine that. So I think the recent past, which people vaguely remember, and which is still relevant to the politics of today, the going over that and the presentation of different arguments about that is really useful. Nothing to do with me. But maybe it is true that later on the people who wrote the history control the view taken of society. I mean, it could be so, but then I'll be dead then, so it doesn't terribly matter.
Back to technology. Was it your interest in advancing your ability to keep your diaries that drove your interest in technology, or vice versa?
Well, it's an interesting question. You see, my dad had his office, and he had all sorts of what would then have been modern equipment in it, in the 30s, by which I mean things like telephones and so on, and typewriters and so on. I've always been interested in technology. I was a pilot during the war. I joined the BBC after the war, so I'm an old BBC man. Then we used to work on 78 discs, and you cut them with a stylus and all the swarf came off, and then you marked cuts with a chinograph pencil long before your time, and you lifted the thing and dropped from one mark to another and did your jump cuts on the machine. Really exciting. And then I was Minister of Technology and for a long time. And I have always believed that technology for good purposes was a great advantage. The problem about technology is it can be used for evil purposes too, and nowhere clearer than in computers. You can use them to bug everybody, or you could use computers to see that everybody had enough to live on, or for medical diagnosis. So that's why I'm very, very keen on the diversion of technology from the means of death to the means of life. I feel very, very strongly about that.
Could you have imagined a day when you had this technology right here on your desk at your fingertips?
No, I couldn't really. I think I'm still astonished at what can be done. You can pick up a phone and ring California. You can put a note in a fax machine and know that at that very moment it's emerging from Australia. But my kids have taught me a lot. See, I remember the first time I came back in a jet from India. I told my children, I had dinner in Bombay and breakfast in London. I told my kids, and they said, "Dad, why did it take you all night to come from India?" Well, when I was a kid, it was 6 weeks at a ship. But for them, the spacecraft, 25,000, they thought she might have popped in half an hour. And so my grandchildren keep me awake and alert. And what they make of it, I don't know. But they certainly have the means to make the world a better place, but also the means to destroy humanity. And that is that moral choice is what makes politics riveting. Not what happens to you, it's what the human race, which way the human race decides to go in the 21st century, which is only, 5.5 years away. That's what the whole of sort of human progress or regress has been about. How do you make the big decision when you have to make it?
Having been surrounded by your diaries throughout their lives, have any of your children or your grandchildren become diarists?
Not really, no. I think probably having seen how much Granddad devotes to it, they'd probably be wiser to spend it on watching the World Series and seeing whether the Reds are doing well. I mean, my wife and being from Ohio, they're all wild Reds supporters, and they were there for one or two of the World Series games a while back. No, I don't think they are. They all keep papers. Oh, my gosh, they keep papers. Not just my wife has got as much as I have, and my sons sheds of their stuff as well. It's a very interesting thing to do, to keep things. I mean, the only thing you do have to do if you keep it is to organize it in such a way you can find it. Because keeping stuff you can't find is like having oil under the territory, not knowing how to find it. So that's a basic organizational structure is what really matters. And that's what takes the time, actually.
Tony Benn, Member of Parliament and a diarist since the age of 9. Thank you for telling C-SPAN about your diaries.
Thanks very much.